Virtual reality is an awesome way to experience things you could have never dreamed of before, but it is also an amazing method of experiencing real-life thrills and activities without the cost, maintenance, or hazards involved in the real thing. You can simulate jumping from a plane without actually going anywhere, whether it be a crappy version of it,
Yeah, we're going alright. We're going.
or an actual simulation. You can visit cool worlds with people from all over the world while being in your own living room. But you can also use VR to play sports and practice skill-based challenges. But does any of this practice in VR actually make you any better at the real thing? And today I'm going to take a look at whether this applies to shooting in VR compared to shooting in real life. Now, I have always been a regular visitor to my local shooting ranges, and a fantastic firearm-focused feast that is H3VR was one of my many reasons for getting a VR headset. But the more I shot in VR, the more I wanted to know whether it actually helped me when I took that knowledge to the range. And before long, I had the idea of setting up a challenge to figure out in what ways it could help me improve. How do I deal with the lack of recoil in VR? What can I practice that can apply to both ends? And many more questions had to be dealt with one by one. But let's start with the core idea. Now, for me to find out whether practice in VR improves my actual skills, I took the time to plan 2 sessions at the shooting range, divided by a week of VR practice. I would go to the range, warm up with 10 shots, and then start a session of 3 cards with 5 shots each, all at 10 meters distance. Then use each day in between to practice with a similar pistol in VR by shooting at the in-game target, and monitoring my average groups and score at the end of the day. After this week, we can compare the results by shooting another real-life set and see if I've improved at any level compared to before. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't intend on doing something like a paper on this, but I thought it would be a fun time exploring the possibilities. The basic idea seems simple enough, but the differences between VR and real life cannot be ignored. The first thing I noticed between VR and real shooting is the obvious weight difference between the index controller and the pistol used for the test. And after finding out how much different that weight really is, I quickly took a look at what I had in my room that would equalize it somewhat. And I came up with a stupid and potentially expensive solution. I strapped my Bear dynamic headphones to my index controller to come pretty close to the weight of the real thing. This would at least help me train with a weight pushing down on my arms. But that weight is not the only thing affecting my arms when shooting in real life. I also have to account for at least a little bit of recoil coming from the real firearm, and even though I cannot simulate that in my VR controllers, I thought it would still be good to take a look at how I can make that difference at least the smallest. I initially chose to shoot and practice with a pistol to compare the results, but pistols come in many different sizes, and with what we had at the range, I went for the smallest type of ammunition to get the least recoil possible. The actual change between these types of ammo is actually pretty big, and to show you this difference, this is what shooting the big lead on the left is like. This is what shooting the very common middle one is like. And this is what I chose to use for the comparison. Of course, this pistol still has recoil, but this choice made sure that the difference between VR and the real thing is the smallest I could get it. With all this knowledge, I set out to do the shooting for the first set of scores. Now, I do not own any of these pistols personally, and because of that, they could be sighted in for someone else. This was evident by all my groups going far left of my point of aim, but as long as I kept aiming for the same spot, it did not matter, as I will compare not only the average score, but also the size of the groups on the card. Meaning, if I got better, then that group on the left would get smaller. I also chose to use a bigger than usual target that is somewhat similar in size as the one in H3VR. Something I would not stop seeing for the next 6 days from that point on. To make sure I got enough training in, I shot at least 300 rounds per day out of a similar pistol in H3VR from 10 meters away. I also made sure to track the score at the end of each day to get some kind of idea if I'm even improving in VR itself. And it didn't take too long for me to realize adding weight to my controller really changes the game when you have to hold your arms up for an hour of shooting. And despite the pistol still being somewhat different from what I shot with in real life, I did feel like I could practice some basics all over again. and pay attention to my stance as well as some trigger discipline and aiming habits. After getting used to VR all over again, I realized that I was indeed slowly improving in the consistency of my groups, but also the average and total scores at the end of the day. And by the last 2 days, I was hitting an average score of over 9.9, and groups that were pretty rare to see at the start of this training started to appear more often than not. To me, this was a sign that I was at least improving in VR itself. The constant routine of daily practice did indeed help me get better at this specific set of circumstances, and I felt hopeful of my chances to at least improve a little bit when taking this new knowledge to real life. But the main question was still not answered, and I had to go back to the range after this week of training to see what I can conclude from this little experiment. When I arrived back at the range, my initial 10 warm-up shots for the day kind of confused me and left me with a little more doubt whether this practice really paid off. The cards seemed to be all over the place in terms of hits, and the feeling of recoil kind of caught me off guard after shooting nearly 2,000 rounds in a virtual environment. But when I actually started the test set, I was surprised with how consistent my shooting had become. As mentioned earlier, this pistol was not sighted in for me, and it still shot somewhat left of the point of aim. But I was definitely seeing a trend appear in the consistency and overall size of the groups I shot with it. Once I got used to the recoil again, it really did feel good to aim, and from as much as I could learn from the circumstances of VR, I could see some of it transfer right back into reality. My stance and arm strength had changed for the better, and I noticed a much more solid grip on the pistol. And when we look at the cards side by side, we see that whatever I did during practice at least somewhat helped me get a group together in real life. Going back to the warm-up shots though, it really makes me realize how much different this specific kind of skill is to practice in VR. Yes, I added some weight, but the drastically different grip of the index controller stayed the same. Yes, I made sure to get as little recoil out of the real pistol as I could, but unless you try this with a pellet gun, you will always have some recoil to deal with. And yes, I could learn some basic habits, but the mushy index controller trigger could not compare to the mechanical click of a real one. All in all, I was very happy to see that practice in VR did pay off in certain ways that I did not expect it to. The cards themselves show the increase of consistency, but I felt like I was also somehow more prepared the second time. I knew what I was working on to improve, and I knew after the warm-up shots what kind of habits I could take from VR and which ones would actually impede on my progress. The fact I've been in the shooting sports for a while may have helped me practice more efficiently in VR. Therefore, if you know what you are doing, you can keep doing it in VR. And using the right methods of practice, it may actually help you improve.